This is ego-utilitarianism with the final installment of the four-part series of the relative theory of value. In this section, I'm going to be presenting the case against the subjective theory of value, and I'm going to be comparing it with the relative theory of value and showing how the relative theory of value or RTV is more superior than STV. Okay, so according to Wikipedia, the subjective theory of value is a value which advances the idea that the value of a good is not determined by any inherent property of the good, nor by the amount of labor required to produce the good, but instead value is determined by the importance an acting individual places on the good for the achievement of their desired ends. It's attributed to the Austrian school. So here's my criticism. I once was told that STV was an ad hoc theory to criticize the labor theory of value. So true theories should stand alone and transcend any historical trivia that concerns it. Theories are supposed to help the mind understand reality, not criticize another theory. The subjective theory of value is a theory of value which advances the idea that the value of a good is not determined by any inherent property of the good. So I have a big problem with this phrase here, by any inherent property. By any inherent property of the good, it totally dismisses or gives zero weight to the inherent property of the good. When the relative theory of value says that's virtually half of what determines the relative value, right? Again, relative value R is dependent upon the inherent property of the good and the consumer, right? Not his mind, but his ability, his external conditions, and maybe some small subjective portion, but more so, everything's all mostly non-subjective as far as relative value is concerned. So actually, it's all non-subjective. And then so you see here that subjective theory of value dismisses the labor theory of value, which is good. Don't have any problem with that. But instead, value is determined by the importance an acting individual places on a good for the achievement of their end desires. Okay, so there's some things in common here with the relative theory of value, right? It mentions desired ends, and that's goals or objectives in when I use it in terms of goals, right? Ends. But the problem here is achievement. So that's utility, right? Place on the good for the achievement, the marginal utility, usefulness, and fulfilling objectives. The problem here is that it places virtually 100%. Yeah, 100% of the value is whatever the subject thinks it is, and that's going to be a problem because we all know we can be wrong. Right? So the relative theory of value acknowledges that subjective value exists. Right? Your opinion exists. Your opinion never is, probably. I can ask you, even if you don't have one, that still qualifies as an opinion, even though it doesn't say anything about anything. But subjective value can be wrong. Right? You've been wrong consuming goods before. You've had buyer's regret. And you've got test answers. You got test questions wrong. You've bought faulty merchandise, defective merchandise, without being able to return it. You suffered consequences due to a bad product, something you couldn't take back, or somehow amend. These are all cases of when you're wrong, right? When you bet, when you wager something on a sporting event, you're wrong. When you make predictions, you're often wrong, right? So it is wrong because of the existence of relative value. You're only wrong when you compare it to something, right? When something doesn't match them, that's when you're wrong. When your expected consequences don't match what actually happens, you're wrong. I mean, when you regret an action, you're wrong. It's because relative value exists. But subjective value itself is relative, right? And I'm going to prove this by writing subjective value as a function of other variables, right? Which may be subjective or non-subjective variables. But since I claim it's subjective value, all the variables must be subjective themselves. Subjective themselves. In other words, completely determined by the mind. And I have to define mind a little later to clarify things. So this is evident in the consequences of consuming the good, right? I mean, some people have bought things that were so defective it led to their death, right? So whoever died in that, in the case where Pinto was sued or whatever, something like that. You know, you buy, let's say you're on a prescription drug and you you buy another drug that interacts with it, so that leads to your death, or you drink alcohol and it has a negative interaction with another drug you take. You valued those two consumption goods wrong, right? You didn't consider the interaction which led to your death. It's because of your imperfect mind, which I'll get into later. So subjective valuation in general is the individual's perception of value, relative value. It's their opinion of what relative value is, right? Makes sense, right? Subjective valuation of a good is the individual's perception of relative value of a good to a particular consumer, the marginal utility of the good to that consumer, right? So this is just saying that you can have opinion about someone else's consumption of a good, right? You can have, in other words, you can have an opinion about someone else's expected what you expect their marginal utility to be after they consume that good. It doesn't have to be from the perspective of the actual consumer, which it can be, but you see that there's no limit to. So the relative value acknowledges that subjective valuation can be evaluated from any perspective. But again, all you have to do for the person making the subjective valuation is give them the consumer, give them the good, and they should be able to form an opinion, and that's a subjective valuation. So subjective valuation is a function of the individual's perception, and perception is a function of their experience or sensory information, and the intelligence, which is the ability to process that information. So you can write it. You should be able to write it as a function, right? So the subjective mind equals the M function, which is a function of subject's sensory data and the subject's intelligence, the ability to process that data, which can be more succinctly wrote as M as a function of D data and I. So M is a function of D and I. So so therefore, subjective value equals the subjective value of a good, or good or any value in general, is S as a function of M, and we know M is a function of D and I. So therefore, by transitivity, S is a function of D and I. So now one can argue that sensory data, especially accurate sensory data, may be dependent on relative value. Therefore, accurate sensory data is non-subjective if you accept that argument. But for now, we'll define senses as the boundary between mind and non-subjective reality, but still entirely part of the mind. Still entirely part of the mind, right? So you can see that subjective value is entirely determined by the mind, therefore a subjective object, which makes sense. So it deserves this adjective, subjective. So it's entirely determined by the mind, you can see here, because I define sensory data as the boundary which separates the mind from non-subjective reality, but still within the mind. Subjective value is one's opinion of relative value of the good. It is their expected value or expected marginal utility. Expected because consumption is a sequence of events at the proper time. You must first acquire the good before you consume it. Since experience and intelligence are fallible, then subjective valuation is fallible. It can and often is wrong. Right? So since your sensory data is fallible, right? Just for instance, the electromagnetic spectrum exists, but the fact that your eyes can only sense the visible portion of the spectrum, which is very small, it would say, your senses would say that light doesn't exist, right? Especially the radioactive one. or microwaves or whatever. And intelligence is finite, right? Your IQ is finite, so your ability to process information, like a dumb person can't process the theory of relativity. Someone of IQ 75 won't be able to process any of these theories I presented or contrasted. Then it makes sense that the product, the subjective valuation of these two are fallible, right? It's almost akin to like the product multiplying to. It's kind of like, yeah, if one or the other is fallible, then the product is fallible. Okay, so subjective valuation is quite dynamic and continuous, so error is virtually ensured, right? Because maximizing utility is virtually impossible because it requires omniscience, perfect information, and perfect intelligence, which is itself probably impossible. Because I know of the omnipotence paradox where it's a valid contradiction based on the way you define omnipotence, right? You can't have something that can do everything. Now there probably is an equivalent of the omniscience paradox. I know there's a paradox where it's a contradiction where you can't have omniscience and free will at the same time, the ability to change the future. The fact that omniscience might be impossible guarantees that subjective valuation cannot equal relative value or non-subjective value if it exists, which I claim. So when you value an activity of consumption, you forego all other activities that are possible. So implicitly, you've made a subjective valuation of all other possible activities. In an Austrian sense, you rank them ordinally, and you selected the one that maximizes utility. The way relative value would say, you've given them a numerical number on the real number line, and then rank them, and then chosen the highest possible value. No one can argue that not. So one can argue that even not possible actions are valued. We just value them at zero because the probability of each action is zero, even though the reward marginal utility is much higher than any possible value. The product of zero and the marginal utility probability times the marginal utility is zero, therefore we value them at zero. It's like expected value, right, in mathematical terms. So if we did not define the boundary of the mind, which I did earlier, right, which is our sensory perception, our senses, then nothing can be subjective. And you can run through the logical proof in your by the definitions. So the subjective theory of value, just based on this article, it assigns an ordinal ranking to goods, which is kind of ridiculous. In economics, when you're considering two goods like they are in this case, we represent them with indifference curves, which is a continuous function. It has a lot more information from my argument, right? Did I make that argument? No. Okay, so okay, let me get to the argument. The difference between cardinal, ordinal, and continuous valuation, right? So cardinal value is by default ordinal value, but ordinal value is not cardinal. Cardinality, which is counting using whole numbers, that's cardinality. It's a term used in set theory to count the elements in a set. The set size, in other words. Cardinality contains more information than ordinal value. That's why you can order things when you cardinally value them, but you can't cardinally value something that just based on ordinal ranking. So there's more information containing cardinal value than ordinal value. One can go one step further and value things continuously, mapped to the real number line. You assign any real number to as a value to an object, especially the value of a good. The advantages of continuous valuation is that you can apply mathematical analysis like calculus to continuously valued objects. You can be more precise too. So continuous valuation is necessary for certain goods, like ones that are sold by weight, which are infinitely decomposable due to weight being mapped to the real number line. Ordinal and cardinal don't work in a money economy, since or work in an economy with a nearly infinite amount of goods. it can't value these cardinal and ordinal can't value things like time, since it can be infinitely decomposed in smaller units, arbitrarily small, right? Because it's again, time is mapped to the real number line. Money almost can be mapped to the real number line. I know the stock market works in fractions of a cent, so so in that case, cardinality kind of doesn't work. You have to shift everything. Probably you have to shift everything up to use cardinality, and ordinally, contains very little information for analysis. So the thing is here. Okay, so let's turn to the diamond water paradox. The diamond water paradox here. There's a paradox in economics. It's not really a paradox. It's not really a contradiction anyway. It's a paradox. It seems like a contradiction, but it really isn't a contradiction. And there are a lot of doctrines out there that propose a resolution to it. The labor theory of value has no solution to it. The subjective theory of value, or a bad solution to it. The subjective theory of value was able to solve this paradox by realizing that value is not determined by individuals choosing between entirely abstract classes of goods, right? Such as all the water in the world versus all the diamonds in the world. Rather, an acting individual is faced with the choice between definite quantities of the good, and the choice made by such an actor is determined by which good of a specific quantity will satisfy the individual's highest subjectively ranked preference or most desired end. Okay, so again, it gives too much weighting on the individual's mind. Relative theory of value says that there's a non-subjective, continuous, ordinal ranking of these things. It's not up to you to determine it. It's up to your conditions, the conditions of the consumer, not his mind, and the ability to process, the ability to utilize the good, and the inherent properties of the good themselves. So it makes more sense, right? The fact that I want something to cut this steak with is not up to me. It's partially determined by how sharp the cutting tool is, right? If time was a constraint, again, I need a more well-defined objective in that case. But anyways, okay, so it's because the market. Okay, so in the diamond water paradox, right? Someone values diamonds so high because someone else has a high marginal utility for diamonds. The fact that you can sell the diamonds for a high amount, that's what gives their worth to a lot of other people who aren't consuming them. So the market, you see how dynamic the market is. Someone else's demand becomes your supply, right? It translates to your demand, right? I'd want diamonds just to sell to you, and so this makes the market more efficient, right? It creates suppliers out of consumers, so the end consumer projects his marginal utility throughout the market. Okay, so the subjective theory of value has no explanation for why we go to experts, why we defer to other people for their opinion, which influences our opinion, which may ultimately affect our decision, or completely defer to them, right? Like, so some people give power of attorney to some people, or total power to their broker to make their investment decisions for them. It's because there's a relative value in existence, right? The fact that you go to experts is because their subjective valuation may be closer to the relative value and thus produce a more desirable outcome for the consumer himself, right? So you can see that not only does it seem like the Austrian school has an aversion to mathematical modeling, but more importantly, it has an aversion to government, or the fact that this implies that government can use mathematical modeling to determine relative value. That means they can better determine relative value, what's best for you, than you can yourself, right? That's where the Austrian school went wrong. They need to take this problem head on. They need to accept relative theory of value, ditch subjective relative value, and just explain that this isn't the case. for the most part, government cannot determine. It's not impossible that they can determine what's best for you, but it's unlikely because the world is so dynamic and diverse that the conditions surrounding the consumer, each consumer, is drastically different in different areas for different objectives, and they can't process this data. Right? You need to decentralize it, and just collecting that data is very expensive. Not only processing that data. So you got to leave it up to the individual to make his decision for him and make them either benefit or suffer the consequences for their actions. So yeah, so that's the whole motive. So now that you know that, now that I made an argument that why subjective theory of values is fallacious, you kind of know there's a motive behind it. I mean, there's more emotion to this theory than anything. Just like the labor theory of value. I'm not saying that that's less emotional, but I claim that the relative theory of value, even though it introduces the possibility of government, it introduces an argument for government. Maybe. I doubt it. I mean, I have to get around that too, since I believe in the free market. You got to take that head on. You can see I have no emotion there, even though I don't like that. I have to accept it. Apparently, the subjective theory of value was ad hoc to that, right? Trying to go around any possibility to introduce an argument for government. Okay, so let's get back to the distinction between price or market clearing price or the negotiated price between the seller and buyer, and value. So the distinction between price and value, right? I can write price as a p function. Again, it's in terms of it always lies in between subjective value of buyer and subjective value of seller, right? So it's a function of those two. So P is a function of S of buyer and S of seller. Price is also dependent upon the relative bargaining power of the seller and buyer. So if the bargaining power is greater for the seller, then the price will be closer to the subjective value of the buyer and vice versa, right? So if the bargaining power is greater for the buyer, then the price will be closer to the subjective value of the seller, which is his minimum price he's willing to accept to sell the good. So bargaining power is dependent upon the relative competition in the supply and demand market. So if the bargaining power is greater, so we often refer in finance to a buyer's and seller's market, right? So if it's a buyer's market, he has more negotiating power, bargaining power. So in that case, the price will be closer to the seller's minimum price he'll take. If it's a seller's market, the price will be closer to the buyer's maximum price he's willing to take. Okay, so that should make sense. Okay, so let me sum up the relative theory of value here. So I've made a case that the labor theory of value, the intrinsic theory of value, and the labor theory of value are defective at the least, and emotional based in a lot of cases, with the exception of the objective theory of value. That seems like it has the least emotion. By objective, in my definition, I mean non-subjective in my definition set. So the relative theory of value is a revised version of the objective theory of value. The relative theory of value is a non-subjective theory of value in my definition set, or in the old sense, objective in the old definition set. So even though my theory may not be perfect, and I pretty much doubt it is, I think overall it's very accurate in explaining reality, but I'd like to see if everything works at least semi-mathematically, since there's so many words here instead of quantity. At the very least, this initial version of the rational theory of value is a better alternative than the other theories I've presented here. I'm hoping that with others' help, I can refine this theory better. That should help better explain the phenomenon of the value of a good, if not value in general. So if you have any, so please like, comment, subscribe. I'd appreciate it if you give me input on this theory. I want to refine it further, especially if you have any valid criticisms. Please present well thought out ideas, because I put a lot of thought into each segment, and the mathematical stuff may have holes, and if you could point those out, if you could point any intuitive criticisms out, I'd appreciate it. So again, this is ego utilitarianism. I might do one more video that sums it all up within 30 minutes. May or may not. Maybe I might have a chat if I can get some interest going on this. Again, like, comment, subscribe, share, and thanks for watching.